The only man to become president without either being elected president or vice president was originally named Leslie Lynch King Jr. when he was born on July the 14th, 1913 in Omaha, Nebraska. His mother and father separated and divorced when the child was just 16 days old, apparently because of spousal abuse. Leslie's mother then moved him to Michigan, where she married Gerald Rudolph Ford Sr. Even though he was never formally adopted, the young man took his stepfather's name, Gerald R. Ford, and made himself Gerald R. Ford Jr. legally in 1935. With a far more stable household, the young man thrived, earned the rank of Eagle Scout, and then went to the University of Michigan, playing center, linebacker, and long snapper for the school's football team, and helped the Wolverines in 2 undefeated seasons and national titles in 1932 and 1933. He did all of this while washing dishes to earn extra money at his fraternity house, Delta Kappa Epsilon. He then went to law school at Yale. While attending Yale Law, Ford joined a group of students led by R. Douglas Stewart Jr. and signed a petition to enforce the 1939 Neutrality Act, and later worked on Wendell Willkie's 1940 presidential campaign. He was admitted to the Michigan bar and began the process of joining a law firm, but then enlisted in the Navy after Pearl Harbor and almost went overboard in a typhoon. After the war, he married Elizabeth Bloomers Warren and had 3 sons and 1 daughter. He had changed because of the war, and his politics were much more foreign and outward-looking. He was elected to Congress in 1948, replacing a long-standing incumbent who held staunch isolationist views. Ford would then serve in the House for 25 years, earning respect for his integrity and his ability to work with the other side of the aisle. Lyndon Johnson appointed him to the Warren Commission, and Ford's job was to study and produce a biography of the life of Lee Harvey Oswald. He then became House Minority Leader after 1964 and became a vocal critic of Johnson and the Vietnam War. He wanted to be the Speaker of the House, but he was denied the chance because the Democratic Party held the majority. So he decided that he was going to retire in 1976. However, fate had something else in store. On October the 10th, 1973, Vice President Spiro Agnew resigned and then pleaded no contest to criminal charges of tax evasion and money laundering, part of a negotiated resolution to a scheme in which he accepted $29,000 in bribes while the governor of Maryland. According to the New York Times, Nixon sought advice from senior congressional leaders about a replacement. The advice was unanimous. "We gave Nixon no choice but Ford," House Speaker Carl Albert recalled later. Ford agreed to the nomination, and he told his wife Betty that the vice president would be a nice conclusion to his career. It would be hardly the conclusion of his career. Ford's term of office and the term of office that followed his, the term of Jimmy Carter, many people said was a time of great decline in America. And yet, despite this, America thrived in a number of ways. So we're going to take a look at the Ford presidency, and then the election of 1976. Then we'll see America held hostage. And then we'll see the golden age of America, the golden age of cinema, the golden age of television, the golden age of music, the golden age of sports, and yes, the golden age of crime. When Gerald R. Ford took the oath of office, he then addressed the nation. "My fellow Americans," he said, "our long national nightmare is over. Our Constitution works. Our great republic is a government of laws and not of men. Here the people rule, but there is a higher power, by whatever name we honor him, who ordains not only righteousness but love, not only justice but mercy. Let us restore the golden rule to our political process, and let brotherly love purge our hearts of suspicion and hate." In many ways, Gerald Ford was the only man that could have put the nation together after Richard Nixon. When he comes into office, one of the first things he does is he offers a full and complete pardon of Richard Nixon. This is very, very controversial with a large number of people. And many said that the pardon of Nixon is what will cause Gerald Ford the election in 1976. But Nixon said, number one, Nixon has suffered enough, and number two, the nation has suffered enough. He offers a conditional pardon of those who had evaded the draft during Vietnam, giving them the opportunity to come home and work in a service-oriented governmental job for 2 years. This, of course, does not go down well with many of the Republicans, especially the conservative Republicans in Congress. But there is an overwhelming Democratic majority in Congress during the midterm elections of 1974 because Watergate still was leaving its stink all over everything. Ford, through his 864 days in office, will veto more congressional legislation than most presidents, and he'll also have those vetoes overridden. Ford immediately gets the succession in order by appointing Nelson Rockefeller as his vice president and having him confirmed. Rockefeller was part of the old Northeastern liberal Republican establishment, which meant that many of the conservatives in the Republican Party did not really like him all that much. Nonetheless, Ford said it, the Republicans went along with it. Eventually, he'll promote Henry Kissinger to become Secretary of State. Three other interesting figures in his cabinet is his CIA director, George Herbert Walker Bush, who himself will one day become the president, and his two chiefs of staff, Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, respectively a Secretary of Defense in the George W. Bush administration and the Vice President in the George W. Bush administration, and also Secretary of Defense in the Reagan administration. The situation at home that Ford inherits is even worse than originally thought. Watergate alone had not made the country bad. Watergate was part of a series of events that had really hurt the American nation. You had the OPEC embargo, which led to long gas lines at the filling stations, something that I can vaguely remember when I was a young man. You also had the delivery of the Roe v. Wade decision in 1973 during Nixon's term, and this begins effectively the right to life movement, and how the right to life movement in many ways begins to slowly take over the conservative wing of the Republican Party. Ford also has to deal with affirmative action. Affirmative action is the giving of special preferences to minorities in hiring, in college applications, and so forth, in jobs, believing that African Americans especially, who had been held down from jobs for so long, now, despite the qualifications, needed to be raised up into certain jobs. Ford was a big supporter of the Equal Rights Amendment, but eventually Phyllis Schlafly, who is a very conservative Republican woman, defeats the Equal Rights Amendment by claiming that this would put women in jeopardy, actually, rather than just simply giving women the opportunity to become corporate CEOs. It would hurt the housewives of America. Ford also has his foreign issues. Kissinger goes and helps negotiate a ceasefire to the Yom Kippur War in Israel. Ford is in New Orleans when Saigon falls in April of 1975. Ford also is continuing talks with the Soviet Union in strategic arms limitations, and in an attempt to improve relations with the communist bloc, he and several other leaders signed the Helsinki Accords, which is the declaration on principles guiding relations between participating states. And it has 10 points, essentially respecting the rights of sovereignty of nations and of borders and peaceful settlement of disputes and non-intervention in internal affairs and cooperation and essentially asking the communist bloc to adhere to international law. And so Ford gets himself ready for what he knows is going to be a tough election in 1976. Now, the Democrats go first because the party that's out of power, their convention always goes first. And the Democratic National Convention in New York City, was chaired by Lindy Boggs of Louisiana, you see in the lower right. She's the first woman to chair a major national convention, and the keynote address is delivered by Barbara Jordan. Barbara Jordan, a Democratic congresswoman from Texas, had actually helped read into effect the articles of impeachment against Richard Nixon. A very eloquent speaker, the first African-American woman to deliver a keynote address. Prior to the convention, the main candidates for office were Henry M. Jackson of Washington, George Wallace of Alabama, remember him? He'd recovered from his crippling attack, and even though he was paralyzed and in a wheelchair, he was still running hard. Morris Udall of Arizona steps into the race, and then, when it becomes apparent that Jimmy Carter is going to become the nominee, Frank Church of Idaho and Jerry Brown, who is the current governor of California, jump into the race at the last minute. But Jimmy Carter wins the race. Before the convention even begins, he has enough delegates for the nomination. And Jimmy Carter, a peanut farmer from Georgia, a man who had served in the United States Navy, was a Southern Democrat running for the White House, the first Southern Democrat to run for the White House, really since Harry S. Truman, and Harry S. Truman was not your quintessential Southern Democrat, so it had been a long time. The Republican National Convention was held in Kansas City, and Howard Baker, one of the two senators on the Senate Watergate hearings, delivered the keynote address. Ford endures a very strong challenge by Governor Ronald Reagan of California, representing the right wing of the Republican Party. Reagan, in a very bitter fight, takes it all the way to the convention. And when the convention meets, the Republicans have still not settled on a candidate. Finally, after all was said and done, the Republicans decide to go with Gerald R. Ford. And then Ford, as a sop to the conservatives in the Republican Party, replaces Rockefeller as his vice presidential candidate and chooses Senator Bob Dole of Kansas. And so you have, in this election, Jimmy Carter and Walter Mondale as the president-vice presidential ticket for the Democrats, and Gerald Ford and Bob Dole as the Republican ticket. It's the only time you'll have all four of those men lose a presidential election, either then or in future years. Mondale, Dole, Ford, Carter all lose presidential elections. Obviously, I've already given away what happens, although I'm sure you good historians know that. It was a lackluster campaign. It was not the most rollicking, hard-fought campaign of all times. At first, Ford was hampered by the pardon, and so he tried a Rose Garden strategy where he showed himself at work in the White House rather than out campaigning. That didn't work too well. So then he hit the trail. When he comes out of the Republican convention, he's down nearly 30 points, but then he begins to close the gap. Carter casts himself as an outsider. He's not part of the Washington Democratic establishment. He is untainted by anything in Watergate. And Carter wins a very tight but uninspiring race, 2% in the popular vote. There you see Carter and Mondale holding up their arms high. Mondale was a protege of Hubert Humphrey from the state of Minnesota. And there you see Ford very calmly looking at the election results that show him losing, while former baseball player and baseball announcer Joe Garagiola is a lot more flummoxed by the whole thing. There you see the state breakdown of the election, the electoral breakdown, and how close it really was. And here you see a county-by-county breakdown of the election. And notice a couple of things. If you look very closely at Louisiana, you notice many of the northern parishes of Louisiana along the Arkansas border, they're really the vanguard of the Republican movement in the South as the South begins to transition more and more toward the Republican Party. And if you look around where the city of New Orleans is, you see St. Tammany, Jefferson, and Plaquemines Parish, as well as the big splotch of Terrebonne, also going Republican. those are the sounds of the theme to ABC News Nightline, which began as a program called America Held Hostage. And it was the time in which, for 444 days, 50 American hostages were kept prisoner in Tehran, Iran, and then eventually released during the Reagan presidency. And I'm sure y'all are enjoying right now the blower outside my office, who decided to start this just as I am recording. We're going to take a look at the Carter presidency. James Earl Carter from Georgia, largely regarded as a less-than-average president, but who has come on in his later years to become quite a citizen of the world. Carter's cabinet: Cyrus Vance, the Secretary of State from 1977 until 1980, and then Edmund Muskie, who you remember from the 1972 Democratic race, who we bowed out, the Secretary of State after him. You also had Zbigniew Brzezinski. Now, you try and say that a couple of times. While you may not know Zbigniew Brzezinski very well, you do know his daughter, Mika Brzezinski, who is one of the co-hosts of the Morning Joe program, which has become embroiled with the current president. What type of president is Jimmy Carter? He tries to eliminate the imperial presidency. That is, he tries to bring the pomp and circumstance of the presidency down just a notch. For instance, he gets out of his car and he walks up Pennsylvania Avenue to the Capitol on Inauguration Day. He tends to be a little less formal in his office, likes to wear sweaters and talk to the American people in a more relaxed setting, which really in some ways didn't work too well. He gives full amnesty for draft evaders from the Vietnam War. As an outsider, and casting himself as an outsider, he has a very contentious relationship with his own Congress. And that's going to be his downfall in so many ways, because after a while, his staff and Congress start getting into pissing matches with each other, and you never want to do that when you are of the same party. I mean, you don't want to get into a pissing match, period, but especially not when you're of the same party. And you have a serious energy crisis that is continuing on. The nation's reliance upon foreign oil was simply getting to be to the point where it was damaging a lot of things about this country. And so Carter goes on TV in a sweater and delivers what is called the crisis of confidence speech. Although he never uses the word once in the speech, many people say that there is a malaise in his speech, the national malaise speech, that there's a sort of a lethargy in America, a feeling of hopelessness and so forth. And people didn't want to hear that from their president. They wanted to hear what Ronald Reagan would say later, that we're Americans, we can get through this, we can do what is right, we will get our confidence back. Carter has a strong foreign diplomacy at first called moral diplomacy, in which he gives a great deal of attention to human rights. The problem is that some of the allies of the United States were some of the worst offenders of human rights, such as the Shah of Iran and the Somoza family in Nicaragua and so forth. He negotiates the SALT II treaty with the Soviets, but then withdraws it from Senate consideration and sends it back to the drawing table. He returns the Panama Canal to Panama. And so this, of course, gets many people in America pissed off by saying, wait a minute, we dug this canal and so forth. Yes, but the terms of the Hay-Pauncefote Treaty did state that at a certain point the Panamanians would get the canal back. He has to deal with the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. He has to deal with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan on Christmas Day, 1979. Because of this, he chooses to boycott the Olympics in 1980. And he issues what is known as the Carter Doctrine, which mandates the use of force against any incursion into the Persian Gulf region. Well, what is this all about? Well, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan once again highlighted the fact that the Soviets are always trying to get to the Indian Ocean. Why is that? Because they need a warm water port. The The warm water port is very, very important, and if they get to the Persian Gulf, then they have a warm water port. This kind of helps explain why the the Russians, are so interested today in Syria, because that is essentially their de facto warm water port. Well, you say, well, wait a minute, isn't the Soviet Union on the sea? Yes, it is, on the Baltic Sea, which is frozen half of the year. Well, isn't there Vladivostok out on the west coast? Yeah, out on the east coast. Yeah, that's way, way, way the heck out past Siberia. The Russian people have always had a problem with a warm water port and not having one. And so Carter issues the doctrine in order to make sure that when the Soviets invade Afghanistan, that they're not going to suddenly turn on Pakistan or on Iran. Despite the fact that the Carter presidency was considered to be a below-average presidency, there is one sterling, shining star in the crown of Jimmy Carter, and that is the Camp David Accords. Since 1948, the State of Israel had existed in almost a perpetual state of war and non-recognition with its Arab neighbors around it. It had fought a series of wars in 1948, 1967, and 1973. Each time, Israel began to expand its territory more and more. And finally, by 1979, Israel controlled all of the West Bank of the Jordan River. It controlled the Gaza Strip, which is a part of the old Philistine region, the Golan Heights near Syria, and all of the Sinai Peninsula. Which Arab nation was going to be the first to recognize the legitimacy of Israel? It would be Egypt, and its president Anwar Sadat, who met eventually with Menachem Begin from Israel. He was invited to come and deliver a speech to the Israeli parliament, which is called the Knesset. And so Sadat became the first Arab leader to address the Israeli Knesset. Eventually, Carter gets them to Camp David and establishes a peace framework for the Middle East, and that is autonomous self-governing authority in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, the evacuation of the Sinai Peninsula, and the adoption of associated principles, that is, principles for relations between Israel and all of its Arab neighbors. This is the first peace treaty between Israel and an Arab nation. And for this, Begin and Sadat were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. When they first went to Camp David, which is the presidential retreat out in Maryland, they wouldn't even talk to each other. They were so angry at each other. Finally, Carter gets them to sit down, and they start yelling and shouting at each other. And Carter says, okay, at least you talk to each other. Then Carter brings them down. He says, look, we're not going to talk business right here. What I want to talk about, family. I want to tell you about my grandkids, and then Sadat, I want to hear about your grandkids, and Begin, I want to hear about your grandkids. And so they begin to talk about each other's grandkids. And in the process, the three men realize that they're all human beings. This was the foundation on which the Camp David Accords were. Begin and Sadat talking about their grandkids. In the upper left, you see Anwar Sadat, Carter, and Menachem Begin in the Aspen Lodge patio of Camp David. And there you see Sadat, Carter, and Begin shaking hands after signing the peace treaty on March the 27th, 1979. The Camp David Accords cannot be understated. This is a sterling accomplishment of Jimmy Carter. The problem was for Jimmy Carter and for many in the Western countries and even in the communist bloc, the developed countries, is that the 70s was a fertile time for a lot of things to endure a golden age, and one of those was terrorism. Why were the 70s such a big time for terror? You think to yourself, oh man, terrorism's terrible today with Al-Qaeda and Daesh and all that kind of stuff. Let me tell you something. Today does not hold a candle to the 1970s. First of all, you had opposition to the Vietnam War that spawned violent leftist groups both at home in America and abroad. You also had Palestinian terrorist groups beginning for the first time to start operating in the West. One of their leaders is the famous or infamous Carlos the Jackal. And governments simply did not have diverted resources for terrorism. I mean, they didn't really understand terrorism at this point. Terrorism's a new thing. So there was not a whole lot of resources from governments directed toward fighting terrorism. I mean, the United States didn't put together a joint terrorism task force until 1980. And so let us turn our attention to Iran. Iran, which is part of the old Persian Empire, one of the great empires of the world. Remember that the Iranian people, and their name Iranian, it comes from the term Aryan. They are not Arabic people. They are Iranian. They are Persian by ethnic origin. They speak Arabic, but they're not ethnically Arabic. And as Persians, they have a sense of themselves as being something great. Now, you mix that together with Islam, and you have something that could be very great, but also something that could be very dangerous. The ruler of Iran from the Second World War to the present was the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. He'd been a strong ally of the United States, and he was considered one of the twin pillars on U.S. strategic policy in the Middle East, the other being Saudi Arabia. But he had a very autocratic rule. He sat on what was known as the peacock throne. And he was seen as his rule was called a kleptocracy. That is, it was stealing from everybody. In 1953, the Shah staged a coup, removed the elected prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh. And so he took over direct authoritarian rule from that point onward. In 1978, Carter went to Tehran. Tehran was a city that was actually thinking about bidding for the Olympics in 1984. Carter spoke out in favor of the Shah on his visit. He called him a leader of supreme wisdom and a pillar of stability in the volatile Mideast. One of his most outspoken critics was Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Khomeini, who you see there in the lower right, was an extreme rightist Muslim cleric, or an extreme fundamentalist Muslim cleric, who, in criticizing the Shah's regime, was exiled to France. When a fundamentalist Islamic regime deposed the Shah, they invited the Ayatollah back from exile, and he became the de facto religious king of Iran, and began to issue what were known as fatwas, which are declarations of war against certain individuals and certain states, including the United States of America. And so the Shah of Iran flees Iran. He's ill. He's got cancer. He enters the United States to be treated for cancer. When he enters the United States, militant students throughout Tehran riot and then storm the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. Remember, an embassy is the sovereign territory of another country. And so militant students essentially invaded U.S. territory and took more than 50 people hostage, took close to 75 hostages, but then began to release them in trickles until it was down to 50. The remaining 50 Americans were held for 444 days. They were U.S. Marines who were embassy guards, there were embassy deputies, clerks, and so forth. The militants holding the embassy in the name of the Ayatollah. The Ayatollah says, I don't control them, but I condone what they did. Said, we must return the Shah to Iran for trial. Then return the Shah's wealth to Iran. Get all of his Swiss bank accounts unlocked. The United States needs to admit its guilt and offer an apology. And the United States needs to promise not to interfere in Iran's affairs in the future. Well, the Shah never went home. After bouncing about from country to country, he finally wound up in Cairo in Egypt, where he died of cancer. And so the Iranians never got back the Shah to be put on trial. And the Iranians now create a fundamentalist Islamic state, around the Ayatollah and begin to sponsor any and all enemies of the United States. Did we try to rescue the hostages? Yes, we did. It was called Operation Eagle Claw, where a series of helicopters would land in the Iranian desert, refuel, and then fly into Tehran, land in the embassy, take no prisoners, rescue all hostages. In the desert, there was a sandstorm. One helicopter ran into the other. They exploded. 8 men were killed. Carter called the abort switch, and Eagle Claw failed. Cyrus Vance, who had been warning President Carter that this was going to fail, now resigned in protest, and that's why Edmund Muskie became the Secretary of State. And ABC News, with its host Ted Koppel, began an evening show at 10:30 Central, 11:30 Eastern, called America Held Hostage, and eventually became a news and politics show called Nightline. In the lower right, you see the blindfolded U.S. Embassy personnel. In the upper left, you see another member of the embassy personnel, and around that red circle is around the face of the man we believe to be the previous president of Iran, Ahmadinejad, the one who loves to go around denying that the Holocaust ever happened. Eventually, the hostages would be released, but not until the day after Jimmy Carter had his last day in office. The Iranians gave it to him big time. Despite the malaise of the 1970s, despite the crumbling infrastructure of the cities and so forth, this was a golden age in so many ways, especially the golden age of cinema. The old big studio system was breaking down. That was the first thing. And so movies had a little bit less control from the top. People were free to do a few more things. There was a new permissiveness in society, especially sexual permissiveness. There was also influence of these new waves from Europe, that is, young directors coming out of Europe. And you also had young American directors who were called the movie brats. The first generation of Americans to actually graduate from schools that were set up for film. Prior to this, you just sort of learned on the studio. Now you went to college and you majored in film, such as a young man by the name of Steven Spielberg. What do the movies of the 1970s talk about? What do they address? Well, there's moral ambiguity. Who are the good guys? Who are the bad guys? And society's kind of breaking down a little bit. That's kind of what these movies are about. You have The French Connection, directed by William Friedkin, starring Gene Hackman and Roy Scheider. French Connection has the all-time greatest chase scene in history, in which a car is actually chasing a New York City subway. You have Chinatown in 1974, directed by Roman Polanski. Roman Polanski, whose wife Sharon Tate was murdered by Charles Manson, and then he was later indicted for statutory rape of a 13-year-old who he thought was older. He is now living in Europe. You have Dirty Harry, directed by Don Siegel, with Clint Eastwood playing the cop that doesn't play by the rules, Harry Callahan, and where you get introduced for the first time to the phrase, "Do you feel lucky, punk?" And Death Wish, starring Charles Bronson and directed by Michael Winner, about vigilante justice. You also had movies that talked about displacement in society, people that did not really get along well in society or who could not fit into society, like A Clockwork Orange, directed by Stanley Kubrick. This is actually not an American movie, but it is very important and got a great deal of following in the United States, about young men who are hyper-violent. You have One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, directed by Milos Forman, starring Jack Nicholson as Randall Patrick McMurphy, a man who enters an insane asylum and begins to show what's really insane and what's not. Dog Day Afternoon, directed by Sidney Lumet, starring Al Pacino. And, of course, the famous, "Hey, you talking to me?" Taxi Driver, directed by Martin Scorsese, of the story Travis Bickle, a Marine veteran who's down on his luck and is mentally coming apart and wants to be important. Actually, Taxi Driver and its young star Jodie Foster would serve as the foundation for a would-be presidential assassin by the name of John Hinckley Jr. in trying to go after President Reagan. And you had a movie about coming home from Vietnam, The Deer Hunter, directed by Michael Cimino and starring Robert De Niro, John Cazale again, and a young actress by the name of Meryl Streep. The 70s had some of the great horror films of all time. The Exorcist, directed by French Connection director William Friedkin. That movie, if you have not ever seen The Exorcist, will scare the living bejeebers out of you. And then there's The Omen, directed by Richard Donner. You know, Richard Donner directed? He directed The Goonies, he directed Superman, and he directed The Omen, the story of the birth of the Antichrist. He had Carrie, the first Stephen King book ever turned into film, directed by Brian De Palma. Halloween, what many thought was just going to be a simple teen slasher movie, was just turned into something else by John Carpenter. The famous zombie movies began with George Romero's independent movie, Dawn of the Dead. He would then go on and make other zombie movies. And then Ridley Scott gave us Alien in 1979, an outer space horror film. And there are plenty of other horror films in the 1970s, like Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Radiohead and so forth. Not Radiohead. I can't remember it now. And you also had great movies. And notice I'm giving you a good list of movies for film and film class one day. Themes of Distrust and Conspiracy. The Parallax View, directed by Alan Pakula, who then went on and directed All the President's Men about Watergate. He had 3 Days of the Condor, starring Robert Redford, directed by Sidney Pollack. And one of the great lines in all cinematographer's history is in the movie Network, directed by Sidney Lumet, in which Peter Finch, playing an anchor named Howard Beale, who's being forced out of the business and going mentally insane, comes on in a rain jacket, soaking wet, and yells out to the world and asks everybody to yell with him, "I'm mad as hell, and I'm not going to take it anymore!" And then you had movies that were blockbusters and feel-goods. In 1975, they were trying to make a film adaptation of Peter Benchley's book Jaws, and they were really having trouble, and they bring in a 27-year-old director by the name of Steven Spielberg. He makes Jaws into the summer blockbuster movie, and he sets the template for the summer blockbuster movie, combined with John Williams and his famous dun, 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 music. Jaws made people afraid to go into the water. And of course there's The Godfather, directed by Francis Ford Coppola, the story of the Corleone crime family and its odyssey through its rise and eventual fall in America. Rocky, in 1976, is just one of those good feel-good movies in the end, directed by John G. Avildsen, who loves to direct underdog movies. For instance, he directed the first Karate Kid movie. You have American Graffiti of 1973, directed by a young brat director named George Lucas, who would go on and he directs some sort of outer space stuff, I'm not sure. You had The Sting, which swept the Academy Awards, directed by George Roy Hill and starred Paul Newman and Robert Redford, about a con on top of a con during Great Depression America. And then when you just wanted to have just a raunchy good time, there's Animal House, directed by John Landis in 1978, starred John Belushi and a young actor by the name of Kevin Bacon. You had Apocalypse Now, story of the Vietnam War, directed by Francis Ford Coppola, starring Martin Sheen and Marlon Brando. It's an adaptation of Joseph Conrad's 19th century epic, The Heart of Darkness, or Heart of Darkness, but it is adapted to Vietnam, and it is an amazingly dark, sinister look at the human soul. And then there is the topic of divorce, which had not really been factored in yet, and that's Kramer v. Kramer, Kramer versus Kramer, 1979, starring Dustin Hoffman and Meryl Streep, about a separated husband and wife who decide that they are both going to vie for custody of their child. One of the reasons why the movies of the 70s were so good is that the acting was just so damn good. Many, many people wanted to play Don Vito Corleone. Tony Curtis, the actor, Jamie Lee's father, actually was going to pay $1 million to get the role of Don Vito Corleone. But Francis Ford Coppola wanted Marlon Brando, who was considered a dark horse pick at best. Now, nobody really expected him. And his way of speaking like Don Corleone, what have you done to deserve such disrespect to come to me on the day of my daughter's wedding and ask me to do murder? Just an amazing performance by Brando. And The Godfather had amazing performances across the board. Young Al Pacino really rose to the top in this. James Caan as the eldest Corleone brother, Santino, Sonny, just outstanding. And the middle brother, Fredo, the weak, dithering brother, who was, in so many ways, just a foil, but also an important cog in the puzzle. In the lower left, you see young Martin Sheen, who's filmed Apocalypse Now. It was so intense on the filming of Apocalypse Now that Martin Sheen suffered a heart attack while it was going on. There you see, of course, the jaws of the shark, and Roy Scheider at the top, Robert Shaw to the left, and Richard Dreyfuss to the right as the three-man team that goes after the shark. And there is old Blue Eyes himself, Paul Newman, and Robert Redford, and The Sting. Now, I hope you didn't think I was going to forget about the lovely ladies whose acting performances were as good, if not better, than the men. In the upper left is Faye Dunaway in her role in Chinatown. Faye Dunaway was one of the most versatile actors. She actually was a model who transitioned very well into acting. She was in Chinatown, 3 Days of the Condor, and In Network. On the lower left is Diane Keaton. You see her in her role as Michael Corleone's wife in The Godfather. She also starred in Woody Allen's probably best movie that he ever had, Annie Hall. You see the lovely Talia Shire, whose name is actually Coppola. She is Francis Ford Coppola's little sister. And because of that, she was cast in The Godfather as the daughter, Carmen, and she's also Rocky's squeeze. Yo, Adrian! In comedy, probably no one beats Madeline Kahn, who you see there in Young Frankenstein. But of course, her most iconic role is that of the German spy Lily von Stupp in Blazing Saddles. At the lower right, second from the right, is young Jodie Foster, who achieved notoriety in a number of films, especially Taxi Driver and The Little Girl Who Lives Down the Lane, acting opposite Martin Sheen, who plays an absolute villain. The upper right, the very lovely and multi-talented Terry Garr in Young Frankenstein, and also in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, the movie Oh God. And in the lower right is Carol Kane, who you see there in her movie Mel Brooks's famous The World's Greatest Lover, as she plays the heartthrob to Rudy Valentine in the movie. Damn good acting, and these aren't the only ones. Personal opinion, I think that the best actor of the 70s, and has remained the best actor for a long time, is Jack Nicholson. Jack Nicholson was just in a number of movies in the 70s that were just iconic and smashing. You see him there as Jake Gittes in Chinatown with his nose and the bandage. You see him as in Easy Rider, which was actually a 1960s movie. You see him in as Randall Patrick McMurphy in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, telling the waitress, "I want you to hold the chicken between your knees," in 5 Easy Pieces. You see him also in The Inheritance and in the Last Mission. And finally, you see him as Jack in The Shining. "Here's Johnny." Jack Nicholson is, in my opinion, just one of the great actors of the time. The great directors of the time, in the upper left, you see Steven Spielberg, all of 27 years old at the time, in The Mechanical Shark that was nicknamed Bruce. One of the things that Spielberg changes when he takes over direction of the film is that the shark is so cumbersome in so many ways that he doesn't really show the shark that often. He makes it under the water more than above the water. Only a couple of times does the shark come out of the water, especially when Roy Scheider says, "You're going to need a bigger boat." Here you see Francis Ford Coppola in a sort of a gallows humor in the upper right, holding a gun to his head. Sidney Lumet in the lower left, and William Friedkin, the director of The Exorcist and The French Connection, immediately to his right, and one of the better horror directors of the time, Brian De Palma, with his camera. 1976 was a golden age for another reason. It's the bicentennial of the United States, the 200th anniversary of the founding of the American nation, the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Here you see the flotilla of ships coming into New York Harbor around the Statue of Liberty. It was also a golden age of television in which television shows reflected the decade. You had things like the themes of displaced youth, the Mod Squad, about 3 folks, 3 wayward teens who were given the second chance to work through the police department. You had political theme shows. The Smothers Brothers ended in 1969, but Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In was a highly political show. All in the Family covered political topics with, of course, Archie Bunker, okay, Meathead. And, of course, MASH, which MASH is actually 2 separate shows. The first 3 years of the show were a comedy about doctors in Korea. The second part of the show, which lasted much longer, actually, and was more driven by Alan Alda, who played Hawkeye Pierce. You see him both times, third from the left. It remained a comedy, but it was a much more serious show, with a little comedy sprinkled in. It had social themes in the TV. Mary Tyler Moore plays a working woman in a news station. Happy Days, talking about the 50s and the 60s, yet really trying to translate it into the 80s and so forth, and the 70s and 80s, excuse me. And of course, Happy Days gives us the term jumping the shark. Jumping the shark means that the show has outlived its usefulness and really should not keep going on any further. And it's because in an episode, a 2-part episode, Fonzie jumps over a shark, takes a challenge and jumps a shark water skiing. You also had comedy of the day. You had The Brady Bunch, which was produced by Sherwood Schwartz, who also gave us Gilligan's Island. Three's Company, which featured the physical humor of John Ritter, about a man living with 2 women in a California apartment, and he has to play like he's a homosexual in order to make his presence in the apartment with 2 women palatable to the rather old-fashioned owners. Laverne and Shirley, about 2 working girls in the time of Happy Days, making all their dreams come true. Sanford and Son, which is actually based on a British comedy starring Red Fox and Damon Wilson, and using, how would I put it, very politically incorrect language. Probably the most groundbreaking show of the 70s was Saturday Night Live. The not yet ready for primetime actors addressing politics and comedy and culture all in one under the direction of Lorne Michaels. In the upper left, you see Clarence Williams III, Peggy Lipton, and Eric Cole. the three stars of the Mod Squad. To their right is the Bunker and Stivic families, Archie, Edith, Michael Meathead Stivic, and Gloria, the very liberated woman, and Archie Bunker, the old bigoted human being. If you recognize the son-in-law Michael Stivic with the mustache, that is none other than Rob Reiner, who's moved behind the camera and is an excellent director. To the right of them is Henry Winkler and Ron Howard, the Fonz, and Richie from Happy Days. Henry Winkler went on to produce MacGyver, and Ron Howard, of course, directed a number of great movies, my favorite of which is The Cinderella Man. And there you see Cindy Williams and Penny Marshall as Shirley and Laverne in the show Laverne and Shirley. Laverne DeFazio and Shirley Feeney, working at a beer bottling plant in Milwaukee. On the lower left, you see the cast of the Mary Tyler Moore Show with the late Mary Tyler Moore down at the bottom, who's unfortunately just recently left this world, and her cast of characters. Centered bottom, you see the Duke, John Wayne, posing with Dan Rowan on the left and Dick Martin on the right at Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In. The blonde girl just above Dan Rowan is none other than Goldie Hawn, Joanne Worley, Gary Owens. You see the long black-haired man. His name is Tiny Tim. Just an amazing cast. And I didn't mention her in the notes, but then there's Maude. And Maude is a spinoff from All in the Family. She plays a woman who has had an abortion, a liberated woman. There in the picture you see the not yet ready for prime time cast members of Saturday Night Live when it first debuted in 1975. Hands on her knees is Lorraine Newman. Cap on his head, John Belushi. With the long blonde hair and the tough look is Jane Curtin. In the middle of the picture is the late Gilda Radner. Hand on his head, bending down, that's Dan Aykroyd. Standing back behind him is Garrett Morris, and in the, whatever that shirt is Cornelius Crane Chevy Chase, who would always start off the Weekend Update by saying, "Good evening, I'm Chevy Chase, and you're not." You know, guys, as a historian, I have a dearth of knowledge truly about music. I'm simply not a music historian. And for me to try and go ahead and give you music history would cheapen it a little bit. I'm giving you the song of the 70s, in my opinion, Jim Morrison's Light My Fire from the Doors. But in truth, I have to say that I know so little about music and music history that I'm going to defer to those more learned than I, and also to the video that you all can watch with the documentary series. What I do know is that the Beatles broke up in 1970, which of course was a major movement. And also you had members of what were known as the 27 Club. There's more than 40 musicians and celebrities who died at the age of 27. And in the 1970s, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison of the Doors, all died at the age of 27. Also, the band Lynyrd Skynyrd suffered a tragedy on their way from Baton Rouge they were on their way to Baton Rouge. They crashed in Gillsburg, Mississippi, which is the first Mississippi exit on I-55 when you're going north. And Ronnie Van Zant and Steve Gaines, Gaines's backup singer, his older sister, assistant road manager Dean Kilpatrick, pilot Walter McCreary, and co-pilot William Gray were all killed on impact, and several other members of the band were injured as well. That happened on October the 20th, 1977. Of course, August the 16th, 1977, we're coming up on the 40th anniversary of the death of Elvis. Elvis died from a drug overdose. He had a physician who was more interested in being Elvis's groupie than his physician, and he overprescribed. Elvis died on the toilet. And the day the music died again was the murder of John Lennon. On December the 8th, 1980, when Mark David Chapman, who had been stalking Lennon for the whole day, finally confronted him outside of his New York apartment and shot him in the back 4 times, and he was killed. America got news of the word of John Lennon's death when they were watching Monday Night Football, a game between the New England Patriots and the Miami Dolphins on the evening of December the 8th, 1980. And it would be Howard Cosell, the very controversial color commentator of ABC Sports and Monday Night Football, who would provide the heartbreaking news.
It's on the line, and I don't care what's on the line, Howard. You have got to say what we know in the booth. Yes, we have to say it. Remember, this is just a football game, no matter who wins or loses. An unspeakable tragedy confirmed to us by ABC News in New York City. John Lennon, outside of his apartment building on the west side of New York City, the most famous perhaps of all of the Beatles, shot twice in the back, rushed to Roosevelt Hospital, dead on arrival. Hard to go back to the game after that news flash, which in duty...
And that is how America learned of the death of John Lennon.
Sitting on 7-14. Here's the pitch by Downing. Swinging. There's a drive into left center field. That ball is going to be out of here. It's gone. It's 7-15. There's a new home run champion of all time, and it's Henry Aaron. The fireworks are going. Henry Aaron is coming around third. His teammates are at home plate. And listen to this crowd. This sellout crowd is cheering Henry Aaron, the home run king of all time. 7-15.
It was April the 8th, 1974, and Henry Aaron hit a home run for the 715th time against Al Downing of the Los Angeles Dodgers. He broke the all-time home run record at 715. He did it at Atlanta Fulton County Stadium, in the city of Atlanta, in the state of Georgia in the Deep South, where he, a black man, received a standing ovation of a crowd of more than 50,000. It marked the 1970s as one of the great decades in all sports. One of the things that really made the 1970s special when it came to sports is that the National Football League came up with an idea. They had actually come up with the idea of a big game of football in 1966. What had happened was, in 1960, a new league had broken on the scene called the American Football League. It was largely based in the West, with teams like the Oakland Raiders, the San Diego Chargers, the Denver Broncos, the Kansas City Chiefs. They played in the afternoon, they played on NBC, and they were capturing a large portion of the American market. And the NFL and its new young commissioner, Pete Rozelle, was now attempting to do the best that they could to either push the AFL out or to assume the AFL in. And to this point, they were engaging in a great deal of antitrust legislation in Congress. But in order to get legislation through the democratically controlled House of Representatives, they had to go through the majority leader of the U.S. House. And that person was Hale Boggs of Louisiana. Now, in order for them to get that antitrust legislation through, Boggs extracted just a little small concession from Pete Rozelle in 1965, and that was that the following year, on November the 1st, 1966, the National Football League, which really wanted to put a team in Houston to compete against the AFL team there, put instead a team in New Orleans. Boggs and the Louisiana delegation, which at the time was incredibly powerful, forced through the antitrust legislation. This allowed the American Football League and the National Football League to come together in 1966. Now, the provisions of the merger were that both leagues would play separately from each other for the first 4 years, and then it would officially merge together into two conferences in 1970. And so the three teams, Cleveland, Baltimore, and Pittsburgh, left the NFL and moved into the AFC. At the end of the year, they agreed to have the champion of their league play the champion of the other league. In the first Super Bowl, the Green Bay Packers, the historically great team under Vince Lombardi, destroyed Kansas City 35-10 in the first game, based on the catching of a wide receiver named Max McGee from Tulane University. The second game, they destroyed the Oakland Raiders 33-14. In the third Super Bowl, however, the New York Jets played the Baltimore Colts, and there, the New York Jet quarterback, Joe Namath, when being told how great a team Baltimore was, turned and said, "We're going to win the game, I guarantee it." Many people use that as bulletin board for the Baltimore Colts, but Namath went out and did short passes and runs and beat the Colts handily, 16-7. And while Johnny Unitas watched most of the game on the bench, not coming in until the middle of the third quarter, when the game was pretty much out of reach at that point. There was another another sport league that was going through its own transition, and that was the National Basketball Association. The end of the Celtics dynasty in 1969 came when Bill Russell, the great center for the Celtics, who was also their player coach, decided to step down. At the same time, another league was coming up in basketball, the American Basketball League, which was beginning to fade. But the NBA decided to try and take in the ABA, which they did. They took in 4 of the teams, Denver, Indiana, San Antonio, and New Jersey, which are now the Brooklyn team. In the 1970 NBA championship, Willis Reed of the New York Knicks played basically on one leg and helped the Knicks win. The next year, Jerry West and the Los Angeles Lakers finally got their championship because Boston was no longer a major power at this point, but just one of the many powers. What really set the NBA off on its path toward greatness was the drafting of Lou Alcindor from UCLA, the 7-foot 2-inch center, later changed his name to Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. First he went to the Milwaukee Bucks and then to the Los Angeles Lakers. The drafting of Bill Walton in 1977 from UCLA to the Portland Trail Blazers also added a spark. But it was the emergence of Larry Bird and Magic Johnson that really took the NBA from an also-ran league in which championship games were being tape-delayed broadcast. Okay, they weren't even being broadcast live, to being the centerpiece that it has become today. Larry Bird had actually been drafted the year before by the Boston Celtics and Red Auerbach, trying to get the team back to prominence. Bird and Johnson then faced off in the NCAA championship, Bird playing for Indiana State, Johnson for Michigan State. Michigan State won 75-64. They were a much better team, whereas Indiana State had just Bird on it. But it was the most watched game in NCAA tournament history, and really made the tournament big time after that. And then Bird and Johnson went to the NBA, where they would face each other 3 times in the NBA championship finals. Magic taking 2 of the 3 from Larry. Magic won 5 championships overall, and Bird won 3 championships overall. In the upper left, you see Joe Namath running off the field, waving his finger, number 1. Joe Namath is the only quarterback in the NFL Pro Football Hall of Fame who actually completed less than 50% of his passes. Yet, his contribution in Super Bowl III that really legitimized the teams coming into the NFL from the AFL is what put the NFL big time on the map. The lower right, you see Jerry West, known as the human logo. They actually used his logo, his figure, for the NBA logo. In the upper left is Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, first drafted by the Milwaukee Bucks and then traded to the Los Angeles Lakers. The very big fro of Dr. J, who was the first man to slam dunk, taking off from the foul line. The upper right is Bill Walton of the Portland Trail Blazers. Walton, unfortunately, developed a series of bone problems in his foot, and he was never completely healthy, but he did win a championship in 1977 with Portland. He also helped the Boston Celtics win a championship in 1986. Lower left, you see Magic Johnson and Larry Bird facing off in the NCAA Finals, and then Bird and Johnson in their Celtics and Lakers uniforms, respectively. 1970s might have been the finest collection of talent in the heavyweight division of the boxing ring. You had the greatest of all time, Muhammad Ali. You had Smokin' Joe Frazier from Philadelphia, the U.S. Marine Ken Norton, George Foreman, who was the gold medalist in the 1972 Olympics. Probably the two greatest bouts of boxing in the 1970s were all three Ali-Frazier matches. The third was perhaps the greatest. It was called The Thriller in Manila, because Ali jokingly went around saying, "I'm going to beat that gorilla in Manila." And it was just an amazing fight that was stopped in the 14th round when Joe Frazier's corner man said the man can't continue, his eyes are closed. And luckily for Ali, this happened because Ali was ready to take off the gloves. He said, "I gave Frazier everything that I was worth, and I had run out of gas by the 14th round." The other important event was Ali and Foreman, the famous Rumble in the Jungle that took place in Kinshasa, Zaire. The match was called by David Frost and Burt Lancaster, of all people. And there Ali did his famous rope-a-dope, where he stood on the ropes the whole time and absorbed the more powerful Foreman's blows throughout the entire event, but on his body. And then he basically wore Foreman out, and in the 8th round, Ali exploded for one of his few big-time knockouts in his career. By the 1970s, the game of baseball was beginning a sort of a decline, a lack of interest. One of the reasons being is that the New York Yankees, who had last won the World Series in 1964, had not won the World Series in 15 years. And without the Yankees involved, it really kind of hurt the game. What was also hurting the game was called the reserve clause. The reserve clause basically said that when a team drafted a ball player, that team owned the player, no matter whether he had a contract or not. That team, and it was almost an indentured servitude, and it really kept the salaries of baseball players down from time to time until a ball player for the Philadelphia Phillies named Curt Flood challenged it. And to show you just how brave Flood was, he realized that if he challenged the rule, even if he won, Flood would probably not be playing baseball for at least 3 years, if at all. And Flood decided to go ahead with it anyway. And in breaking the reserve clause of baseball, it meant that the players now owned their own labor. It meant that they could go and negotiate with another team that was willing to pay them more than the team that originally had them. Some of the major events of baseball of the late 60s and the 70s, the Miracle Mets of 1969. The New York Mets were a team that had been put together in 1962 after the Giants and Dodgers had gone west. And as a result of this, the Mets were an expansion team, and they were a pitiful team until 1969 when they put it all together and won their division in the last 6 games of the season over the Chicago Cubs and St. Louis Cardinals, then dispatched the Atlanta Braves in the championship series, and then defeated a supposedly much more powerful Baltimore Orioles team that was just coming into its own, 4-1. 1972 was a tragedy for baseball when Roberto Clemente, the great slugger from Puerto Rico, went down trying to bring relief to earthquake victims in Nicaragua. Clemente was one of the greatest baseball players ever, and many said that he may have broken the home run record before Henry Aaron did. In the late 1960s, the Athletics franchise had gone from Philadelphia to Kansas City to Oakland, where they were purchased and owned by the very flamboyant and controversial owner Charlie O. Finley. Playing out in Oakland, he changed their uniforms to where they were wearing white shoes, put together some very, very, very talented teams that are anchored by pitchers Vida Blue and slugger Reggie Jackson, and proceeded to win the 1972, 73, and 74 World Series. In 1973, the New York Yankees were sold to George Steinbrenner. CBS, the news corporation, had owned the Yankees for quite a while, and they sold it to Steinbrenner, who was a shipping magnate from Cleveland, Ohio. The Steinbrenners immediately begin to pour money into the organization. They even decide to revamp Yankee Stadium at the time and do a restoration of it, an upgrading of Yankee Stadium, and they start going out looking for the best talent. Nonetheless, this does not, at first, make a difference in baseball. It's the 1975 World Series, in which the Boston Red Sox took on the Cincinnati Reds, the Big Red Machine, under the direction of Sparky Anderson and starring people like Tony Perez and Davey Concepcion and George Foster and Johnny Bench and would-be Hall of Famer Pete Rose, except for the fact that Pete Rose was as dishonest as the day is long. Cincinnati won the series 4-3, but it was Game 6 in which Carlton Fisk's home run to win the game, was the iconic view of the World Series. It captured the attention of the nation and resurrected the game of baseball. And then came the 1977 World Series, in which the New York Yankees, who had lost the World Series the year before to Cincinnati 4-0, now added Reggie Jackson to their roster. And in Game 6 of the World Series against the Los Angeles Dodgers, Reggie Jackson saw 3 pitches in the strike zone, and he hit all of them into the seats. The last one, a massive blast into center field. 3 home runs in a game. No man had ever done that other than Babe Ruth, who had done it twice. Reggie Jackson gave himself his own nickname. He called himself Mr. October. And with the Yankees back, baseball was back. And with the Steinbrenners running the Yankees, it was always an interesting time as George Steinbrenner would go through managers right and left. In the upper left-hand corner, you see Joe Frazier knocking down Muhammad Ali in their first fight at Madison Square Garden. Ali, who had a little bit of a bump on his face, came out of the fight feeling pretty good. And as he laid on the bench, they came in and they said, "How do you feel, champ?" Because this was his first match back after he had been barred from fighting for draft dodging. He said, "I feel great. Millions of people are paying millions of dollars to watch 2 black men beat the hell out of each other." Joe Frazier, who actually won the fight, had to be taken to the hospital with high blood pressure. That's how much this match took out of them. And the Thriller in Manila was even worse. The lower right, you see Ali standing over George Foreman. This was the upset of upsets, the rumble in the jungle. 8th round, Ali, who had been doing nothing throughout the fight, suddenly exploded and knocked Foreman out. What about sports and society at large? Sports is always a venue to tell something deeper about society. As little as I know about music, that's as much as I know about sports. One of the great events was the Battle of the Sexes match, in which Bobby Riggs, an elderly tennis hustler, he had won Wimbledon many years earlier. He took on Margaret Court, who was the current reigning champion of tennis, and beat her soundly. And then went around saying how men are superior to women, and he's a hustler. He's trying to market a brand and make money. Until finally he offers a big prize to any woman that could beat him, and Billie Jean King takes him up on it. And Riggs, who's the promoter of the whole thing, and brings in Billie Jean King on the whole deal. He says, "Look, you're in on this, all right? The only thing that's really going to count is when we play the actual game of tennis. Up to this point, nothing I say or do is going to make any difference between you and me." They loved each other. They were good friends. And so he puts together a match in the Astrodome in Houston. 30,492 people show up for the largest attended tennis match in all history. Riggs is up 4-2 in the first set, and Billie Jean's like getting worried that I'm not going to become like Margaret Court. And she puts her game face on and proceeds to beat the living crap out of Bobby Riggs in straight sets at the Astrodome. Of course, Bobby Riggs leaps the tennis net and gives her a big hug. He had her brought in on a chair, carried by very, studly guys, and he was, just quite the showman, the chauvinistic showman. He was mud for a long time, but after a while, people began to realize he was just playing it up, and he made a ton of money off of this. 90 million people tuned in to watch the tennis match throughout the world. And what about the Olympics? The Olympics is where Cold War tensions were often played out. This didn't affect the United States, but the murder of the Israeli athletes by Black September terrorists in 1972 was a clarion call to everyone that, the ancient Greeks who stopped their wars to have the Olympics, we weren't the ancient Greeks. Then came the debacle of the gold medal basketball game, in which the U.S. Supposedly beat the Soviets 50-49, but twice the game, more time was put back on the clock, and the Soviets finally got a chance to win on the third attempt. They put it in, won. The U.S. did not even show up to collect their gold medals, even after the protest was overturned. And those silver medals, remain in a vault in Geneva, Switzerland, and people have written into their wills that no family member or anybody associated with them can ever collect that silver medal because they feel like they earned the gold medal. In 1980, the Winter Olympics were held in Lake Placid, and there the U.S. hockey team faced the Soviet Union in the semifinal game. This is about the same as a high school junior varsity team playing the Dallas Cowboys in football, when the Dallas Cowboys were the toast of the town. Nonetheless, the United States wins 4-3 on a goal by Mike Eruzione. Now, this is not the gold medal game. The U.S. has to play Finland 2 days later on a Sunday morning, and when they enter the third period, the U.S. is down 2-1. At which point, Coach Herb Brooks enters the locker room, looks at them all straight in the eye, and says, "If you lose this game, you will take it to your graves." Then he walks out of the door, puts his head back in the locker room, and says, "Your fucking graves." The U.S. goes out and scores 3 goals in the third period and wins the gold medal. The miracle had come true. The Summer Olympics that year were scheduled to be in Moscow. But the U.S. led the boycott of many of the Western nations, not all. Great Britain went, but the U.S. led a boycott of the 1980 Summer Games in Moscow to protest the invasion of Afghanistan. President Carter would not let them go, and part of that was based in part on what had happened in Munich in 1972. That is the Miracle Mets in the upper left-hand corner, and the catcher putting up on his body a young pitcher named Nolan Ryan, who made his debut for the Mets that year. On the right is picture of Vida Blue of the Oakland Athletics, and you see their very colorful gold-green uniforms with white shoes. The lower left, you see Pete Rose of the Cincinnati Reds getting into a scuffle with Bud Harrelson after a hard slide. This is in the 1973 National League Championship Series, which the Mets won, swept from Cincinnati, and then lost to the Oakland A's in 7 games in the World Series. It was Willie Mays' last hurrah. And finally, on the right, you see Carlton Fisk begging the ball to stay fair until it hits the fair pole and bounces back into the field of play, which means home run. And Boston wins Game 6. And you see there Bobby Riggs in the blue taking on Billie Jean King in the far court. And Billie Jean King hoisting her trophy for taking the prize. And the New York Daily News giving Bobby Riggs a little dose of crow. Riggs could care less. He was famous, and he had pocketed a great deal of money. The March 1980 cover of Sports Illustrated was the only cover of Sports Illustrated that had neither captioning nor subtitling on its cover. It felt that the Miracle on Ice needed no explanation to Americans. The interesting thing about the Miracle on Ice, though, is that the only people that actually saw the Americans defeat the Russians live were the 7,500 people inside the Olympic Auditorium. The game had been tape delayed because the producers on ABC believed that the bigger story would be American speed skater Eric Heiden, who was going for his 5th gold medal. And so the game was broadcast that evening in the United States. Most of the people had already figured out what had happened by then, because despite the fact that they told the affiliates not to publish the results, they went ahead and did it anyway.
I got blisters on my fingers. When I get to the bottom, I go back to the top of the side. Where I stop and I turn and I go for a ride. Till I get to the bottom, I see you again. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Do you, don't you want me to love you? Coming out fast, 1 miles above you. Tell me, come on, tell me the answer. You may be a lover, but you ain't no dancer. That's a skiller. That's a skiller. That's a skiller.
This song by the Beatles would be cited as the inspiration for one of the worst crime spree and mass murders in the entire history of the American nation, and definitely of the 1970s. It was a golden age of crime, without a doubt, in this country in the 1970s, as police corruption was rampant throughout the cities. A whistleblowing cop by the name of Frank Serpico, Al Pacino portrayed him in a movie, blew the whistle on cops that were essentially working for the criminal elements in the city. And this created the need for the Knapp Commission that purged the NYPD through and through. You also had a problem of urban crumbling, and you also had disaffected and disconnected youth. And this went across socioeconomic lines. Rich as well as poor came under the spell of many leaders and cultish figures and so forth. A large number of criminal gangs were running rampant in the cities: the Savage Skulls, the Black Spades, the Ghetto Brothers, the Deadly Bachelors, the Javelin, the Dirty Ones, the Tomahawks. These are just some of the names of various gangs, all of which that I just mentioned ruled the Bronx. You also have the Symbionese Liberation Army, whose cobra with the 7 heads was their flag. They were a leftist organization that appealed to young students. They saw themselves as a vanguard army of the sort of proto-revolution. They undertook bank robberies, they committed 2 murders, and various other acts of violence against people. The most notorious thing that they did is they kidnapped Patty Hearst, who was the heiress to the Hearst family, the famous Hearst newspaper family, William Randolph Hearst. But when it became evident that she was on the video actually perpetrating the crimes as well, she was put on trial, and she basically claimed Stockholm Syndrome, that she began to identify with her captors. She was brainwashed, she was terrorized, and forced into doing it. Nonetheless, she was found guilty and sent to prison for a time. But of course, the Manson family is the one that really captures the imagination of the American people to this day. The Manson family was a quasi-communal group of people that arose in California in the late 1960s, led by Charles Manson, who was a young boy that was shuttled from foster home to foster home, had barely knew his mother, did not know his father. He was treated horribly as a child. And, well, the bill came due for that kind of thing. The Manson family gained notoriety after the infamous murder of actress Sharon Tate, who was the wife of Roman Polanski. She and 4 others were murdered on August the 9th, 1969, by Tex Watson, who was the only male member of the Manson family, and then 3 other members of the family, all acting under the instructions of Manson. Strangely enough, Manson himself never lifted a knife. That should tell you something. The group members were also responsible for a number of other murders and assaults, and even the attempted assassination of President Ford. Serial killers had been existing throughout the history of the country, but it seemed like the 1970s they were fertile ground. You had the Zodiac Killer, who was never caught, and David Lynch made a movie about it with Jake Gyllenhaal, tracking the serial killer, the Zodiac Killer. And, of course, you had the son of Sam, David Berkowitz, who was called the 44 caliber killer until he began corresponding with the police, taunting them, and then taunting them through the newspapers, corresponding with the famous columnist Jimmy Breslin of New York Newsday. You had the Hillside Stranglers, Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Bono Jr., Ted Bundy, who was the handsome, sort of preppy murder type. And then you had Edmund Kemper and Robert Hansen. Edmund Kemper was the famous cannibal murderer. It was an era of robberies as well. The Pierre Hotel robbery of 1972 netted close to $3 million at the time. That's $17 million today in cash and valuables. The United California Bank robbery netted $30 million, which is $172 million. And then there was the Lufthansa heist of 1978, which was led by a gang consisting of Jimmy Burke in the upper right-hand corner and Henry Hill, who eventually let his drug problem get the better of him, and then he became FBI informant and sent away close to 50 mobsters, and basically put a big chink into the Lucchese crime family. The Lufthansa heist is featured in the movie Goodfellas, and Henry Hill's character is portrayed by Ray Liotta in the movie, and Jimmy Burke's name is changed to Jimmy Conway in the movie, and his character is played by Robert De Niro. Jimmy the Burke was also known as Jimmy the Gent. The interesting thing about the Lufthansa heist is that after Jimmy Burke and his gang, and Henry Hill was not part of the heist, he was associated with the heist, but he was not part of the heist. But after the gang robbed Lufthansa, Burke began to kill and murder every one of those that took part so that there could be no connections. We do not know whatever happened to the money. Perhaps the worst massacre of Americans that did not take place on American soil was the Jonestown Massacre of November the 18th, 1978. The People's Temple was a religious community located originally in San Francisco. And they were a very leftist organization, had elements of Christianity and socialist politics, definitely had a focus on racial equality. At its peak, the temple probably had about 20,000 members, and had connections with the left wing. But eventually, Jones left San Francisco with many of his communities to go to Guyana in South America, and there they began to create an agricultural commune at a place that he named after himself called Jonestown. It was an American communist organization, but communist with the small c, not with the, hammer and sickle and all that kind of thing. In the end, 909 people would die in this. And what happened was that Congressman Leo Ryan, the 11th Congressional District in California, flew to Guyana to go and inspect for himself on the word of parents that said that their children were being kept there forcibly. When Ryan went there, he confronted Jones on that and told Jones that he was taking home those that wanted to return to their parents. When he got back to the airstrip with those, Jones had ordered the guards there to shoot and kill everyone, and they killed Congressman Ryan. In the end, 909 people died. All but 2 of them died from drinking a sort of a fruit punch drink laced with cyanide. It's where you get the term nowadays, drink the Kool-Aid, which most people using it don't even understand where that comes from. But it was a horrific, horrific thing to have happen. On the left was Jim Jones, who early on seemed to be a firebrand for racial equality, even got the Martin Luther King Humanitarian Award, but became more and more erratic as time went on and began to see himself as almost a messianic figure. On the right is Congressman Leo Ryan, who would eventually be murdered on the airstrip, and there you see the absolute tragic picture of the men, women, and children that were all dead. Those that did not drink the drink were actually murdered, although there weren't many of them. The important thing that you need to understand about serial killers, and I'm not teaching a criminal justice class, and I'm not teaching a class in human psychology, but I am teaching a class in history. And every one of the serial killers, Charles Manson, John Wayne Gacy, Ted Bundy, David Berkowitz, they were not monsters. They were not born as monsters. The times in which they lived, the culture in which they lived, the treatment that they received, the mental illness that they were born with created them into monsters. These are human beings. And I point that out simply, and you'll have to excuse me if I get a little soapboxish about this, but it's one of those there but for the grace of God moments, or fate could have been kinder to us than to them. And that's important to understand, that these are human beings. And I'm not saying we need to have pity for them. I'm not saying that I'm giving you all that gobbledygook about, we got to try to understand these people. No, what we need to understand is that they are people. Charles Manson, John Wayne Gacy, Ted Bundy, David Berkowitz. These are human beings. It's human beings that kill. And it is human beings who are often used as the pawns and tools of these either culturally made or socially made monsters. In the upper left, you have Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten laughing as they walk to court in Los Angeles. These are murderers, and yet they're young women. Bottom left is Lynette Squeaky Fromm. She tried to assassinate President Ford. In the upper right, you have Manson family members outside the courtroom having shaved their heads. And in the lower right, you have Susan Atkins, and following her is Vincent Bugliosi. Vincent Bugliosi is the man who prosecuted Charles Manson and sent him to the death chamber until California rescinded its death penalty. He was a Los Angeles County Deputy District Attorney. He prosecuted Manson and got Manson convicted, even though Manson did not lift a knife to stab anybody. Charles Tex Watson, the guy that really did the horrible slashing, and then Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten, who you see there. Susan Atkins is the one that was the first really to turn and give the evidence that it was Manson pulling the strings. What do we learn by this? Is this an instance that mankind took a serious downturn in the 1970s? No. Mankind had always been dark in certain ways. Human beings had always had a little devil inside of them. But the 1970s, for some reason or other, began to highlight even more the soul, the darkness inside of human beings. And it is a very good thing to keep warned of this when it comes to history.